You're listening to the podcast for all of the news, notes, and breakdowns for your Ohio State Buckeyes. This is Sons of the Shoe with Nick Wilson and Spencer German.
Nick Wilson and Spencer German are back. Sons of the Shoe is back. That's right, guys. And we've got, well, Spencer got to react to the Cotton Bowl loss, 14-3. We have a little bit of reaction on that. Of course, we now have the national title game that is set. A little bit more Ohio State panic. Maybe our Batman, right? Maybe our White Knight coming to save the Ohio State football program. And we will also fix the Bulls. But as we are a new podcast, please make sure to follow Sons of the Shoe wherever you get your podcast. That includes Apple, Spotify, the free Odyssey app. But hi, Spencer German. How you doing, bud?
Can't complain, Nick. Just recovering from last night, staying up, watching the two college football semifinals. I actually thought it was nice this year to have two games that were competitive, because the story obviously about those games in the past has been that usually one is a blowout. So to see both games end up coming down to the wire, I think was fun. Granted, obviously the first game we aren't too fond of, but I think now we all, I've always liked the color purple, both the movie and just the color itself. It's a nice color.
What about the new movie musical they have coming out now? Have you not seen that yet?
Can't speak to that. I haven't seen it yet.
It looks fantastic. I'm just saying.
No, I mean it's if it's about the same, it's the same storylines, I assume. So I'm sure it's probably pretty good. So I might have to check it out in the spirit of trying to support the color purple here leading up to next week's national championship game. So there you go.
So it was a crazy night. And I honestly, kudos to Washington and Texas, because Alabama, Michigan was kind of that throwback. It was a high wire act of who's going to screw up the most and who's going to screw up latest.
Which is funny because I kept finding myself saying Bama, they had untimely penalties. They'd have untimely turnovers. They would have just shooting yourself in the foot mistakes. And they also have a kicker, by the way. And I was like, this is not the Nick Saban Alabama team that I'm used to. Usually they are the most disciplined team in college football, and they don't have a kicker. Now they actually have a kicker, but they've given up. I guess they had to sacrifice to the football gods some of being like just all around good so that they could finally have a good kicker.
They had to sacrifice a well-rounded offense for just having a kicker. I like that. I mean, if you think about it, what is miraculous is that Alabama had a 20-13 lead with inside 2 minutes to go, and they have a one-dimensional offense. And I think that's really fascinating. It's funny because people have poked fun at Nick Saban's teams for not being well coached. I think if you've got a one-dimensional offense, which in college football now in the playoffs, offense seems to matter more than anything. To have a 7-point lead with 2 minutes to go, and Jalen Milroe, one, got hit a lot last night. Two, just the passing game was not there consistently. And even the ground game, like he made some plays, but this wasn't, some of his more high-profile games. And then for Michigan to kind of have to come from behind and kind of steal a win in overtime, I thought was really interesting. And listen, I think you saw in the Washington-Texas game what can happen when you have two elite-level quarterbacks going. And I think Quinn Ewers is a step below Michael Penix, but they're both ridiculous playmakers. I mean, both quarterbacks kind of have that ability to feel pressure and then kind of make chicken salad out of chicken scratch. And I thought, Michael Penix just put on a show. Michael Penix might have jumped from like a third rounder to a first rounder last night because of what he did. And I slightly facetious there, but even Quinn Ewers, that thing, it looked like a blowout. And then out of nowhere, Texas storming back into it. And that game ended into the wee hours of the night, just absolutely killing everybody who had to wake up for their first day back to work today. So thank you for that. But no, that was the best first round of playoffs combined we've seen. And it does make me wonder whether, and maybe this is, you can skew it one way or another, whether we got the best football we're going to have, because now all of a sudden the stylistic differences between Washington and Michigan are going to be night and day, as opposed to Michigan and Alabama playing a similar style of ball, and the same thing with Texas and Washington.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, like last year we got last year was similar in that we had games that were solid in the semifinal rounds, and then the final became an absolute just blowout of a game.
Yeah.
And you're hoping to avoid that, I think, this year. But you're right, like stylistically, I guess on some level, Michigan is maybe used to seeing a team like Washington in like what Ohio State usually is. Because like last year, I would probably say Ohio State was very similar to what Washington is this year. They have a great quarterback. They got really good receivers. They're going to certainly be throwing the ball. They rattled off a stat early in that game last night about how Washington, prior to like week 8 or something like that, their run to pass ratio was just like there was this massive discrepancy between it. It was like 70 or like 68 to 32. And then they started over the last like 4 or 5 games, it went back to be more like 50-50. So they've clearly tried to prioritize trying to run the football a little bit more. But you know what they want to do. And you have a great quarterback in Michael Penix Jr., who is going to allow you to do that. I think certainly Michigan's going to see the best quarterback they faced this year in Michael Penix Jr. I also thought it was funny, and we talked a little bit before we started recording here about it. Like, I laugh at the, and then this, I guess maybe there's a little bit of homerism in this, being an Ohio State fan, that I kind of get a kick out of the people who are trying to like stretch to make JJ McCarthy some great NFL player. But I laugh at the commentary on JJ McCarthy being an NFL prospect, and all the things that people use to describe him are just like character traits. They're like, oh, he's got a lot of heart and he's really tough out there. And when things get tight, he's not going to, pucker up. He's going to really power through and lead his team to victory. And then you go turn on the Texas Washington game, and Michael Penix has a defender in his face and just drops a dime of a pass down the sideline. And you're like, holy crap, this guy playing a different sport. And the commentary on him is like, oh yeah, pinpoint accuracy and the stuff that you actually want to hear somebody talk about when they describe an NFL quarterback. So it's just funny to see the discrepancy there. And I do think like the second matchup last night gave us like the 2 better quarterbacks, which made the game certainly maybe not. The 2 games were both fun in their own way, but that one was certainly more fun in terms of like the modern version of football. So it'll be interesting to see how that style contrasts with Michigan. I do think that Washington's defense might have some trouble stopping Blake Corum, which is probably, I'm guessing Michigan's game plan is going to center around like, we're going to run the football, which is their kind of their identity anyway. And can Washington stop us? And even if they can't, I think on the flip side, I think Michigan's defense, they've been able to take care of a lot of quarterbacks that aren't as mobile or that only can do so much. Penix feels like he's the full package. So I'm curious to see how they defend him and if they're able to slow down that offense that's been so good. I think equally these 2 teams might be able to put up some points, and then it might just be who kind of gets the momentum going in their favor, or who doesn't make the big mistake or turnover. But yeah, it sets the stage for a big game, even though I'm certainly hopeful that one team wins over the other for sure. It's not gonna. There's not gonna be a lot of times I go into these national championship games when Ohio State's not involved, and I can just be like, all right, I'm just gonna enjoy the game. This one, I'm not going to be enjoying as much because I definitely I'm leaning one side over the other.
I just think it's interesting after watching last night, and I don't mean this in a way to disparage any of the 4 teams, because I think Washington has been maybe one of the most slept-on dominant teams in college football history.
We've talked about that a lot.
And it's almost disrespectful at some point. Like, Michael Penix absolutely is elite. Michael Penix should have clearly been the Heisman, in my opinion. And like then you start to go to some of the other talent. Braylon Trice is a dude. Their wide receivers, they just have some phenomenal wide receivers as well. So they got guys, and I just think they're disrespected. Now that being said, and I don't. It's funny because now you have to compare it to what you saw in the Cotton Bowl, and one, I think your team would have looked a little different if you were playing in the playoffs. So I think that's important to kind of offset any concerns about scoring 3 points against Missouri in the Cotton Bowl. But if you just had a better quarterback, and meaning like all season long, if you had a better quarterback and you had made the playoffs, I'll be honest with you, there's nothing that tells me that Ohio State couldn't have hung with the teams we saw yesterday outside of the quarterback position. Like it only highlighted, watching that game last night only highlighted, like you mentioned JJ McCarthy. He's acceptable. But acceptable was better than Kyle McCord, and it damn sure was better than Devin Brown in the Cotton Bowl. So you go to Jalen Milroe. The guy's got one elite skill, which is scrambling around the field right now. But that offense is one dimensional. And so that's the difference. Is you had a quarterback with nothing elite who was just kind of okay. He was just kind of there. And then as we saw in the Cotton Bowl, like you had a quarterback who was less than what Kyle McCord was. And it's just crazy to watch last night and remember, like, the only thing that separated you from beating Michigan and from potentially winning a national championship, or at the very least just being in the playoffs again and being in a closely competed game, the only difference was the quarterback position.
I think that's a fair point. I think maybe you could throw offensive line in there, and I'm sure we'll get into that conversation as well. As I'm curious to hear some of your overall thoughts on what happened on Friday night, because I had a chance to talk about it for an hour with many of our viewers and commentators on YouTube. But I'm curious to your thoughts. So I know we'll get to that here coming up, but I think that certainly was glaring in watching those games last night. Was the quarterback play was the biggest thing holding Ohio State back.
And real quick on that, it's a damn shame that Marvin Harrison Jr., who as great as he was this year, he was held back by the quarterback play. It's a damn shame America didn't get to see this version of Marvin with the appropriate level of quarterback. Yeah, because it would have been really fun. He would have been the talk of town, just like Michael Penix is right now. Win or lose, it would have been Marvin Harrison Jr. and Michael Penix would have been two of the biggest things to come out of these playoffs.
Well, and I guess America did get to see that, I guess, a little bit last year. They got at least a taste of that with C.J. Stroud and Marvin Harrison Jr. Because let's face it, I mean, Marvin Harrison Jr. was putting on a show in that game. Georgia had no answer for him. And if he doesn't get knocked out because of the hit to the head, you almost wonder if Ohio State does win that game, and then you get a second game of Marvin Harrison Jr. In the national championship with a chance to do it again. So, I think that was what was the most glaring about those games last night, because we obviously are watching these things from an Ohio State angle for sure. But one other note on Washington being slept on. They're going into this championship game now as, I think, a 5.5 point underdog. Every step of the way, they keep being listed as an underdog. They were a double-digit underdog against Oregon, who they had already beaten once this year. And then I think that matters, because you talk about like being battle-tested. Listen, credit to Michigan. They got their first. Ohio State was probably their first like real test. They rose to the occasion, got the late turnover. You wonder how that drive ends if things go a little bit differently. But they got the win. They go on. They win the Big Ten. Now they go to the playoff. They get tested again on the big stage against Bama, and they were trailing late in that game. They pulled off a great comeback. Credit to them for pulling off the drive to tie things up and then winning it in overtime. But now you talk about teams that have been like tested. Of the two teams left, Washington has been way more tested coming out of a Pac-12 that, like you said, you've been saying it all year, and I've agreed, was maybe the best conference in football this year. You had to play the likes of Caleb Williams. You had to play Oregon twice, and you beat them twice.
Don't sleep on that Utah team. That Utah team would have been probably the third best team in the Big Ten this year.
You had to play Utah, who's always that's always like a battle. You had to, Washington State, your biggest rival, took you to the brink. Like, they have been tested and they have withstood. Now they beat Texas. Like, they have beaten everybody in front of them, and they continue to just prove everybody wrong that wants to make them underdogs. So I think that does matter in the context of that conversation as well. And I'm curious to see, obviously, how that one plays out. But yes, from an Ohio State angle, I think we did see that the quarterback play was the biggest thing separating them from being on the same level as these teams. And if they had that, they would have been right there with these teams. Real quick too, Nick, does the semifinal games being as competitive as they were validate the committee made the right choice?
I mean, yeah, I guess in a way. I mean, I think the reality is, I think some people wanted to deny what happened to Florida State. was some sort of where Georgia just kicked the living crap out of them. That was some sort of a moment that proved that the college
Yeah,
football selection committee
it
did
was a
right.
different. It was a completely different team.
But I will say though, like I don't outside of Jordan Travis playing against Georgia, I don't know what Florida State was going to put out there on the field with Keon Coleman, and I love Keon Coleman. With like go to some of the big names that actually didn't play in the game, and like I get it, but the reality is you got curb stomped by a better team. And I think if you put that with the actual playoffs, I'll be honest with you, if you're looking, I don't think this is the year that the college football selection committee needs to be validated because one, next year is the 12 year or the 12 team playoff, and two, I just think, quite frankly, like I think they made the right decision. And I think people who are against it either are ACC honks, Florida State honks, or just don't like the system. And I think there's a lot of that in college football. I think there's a lot of it doesn't really matter. Like whatever the system is fucked. Right? If we're going to determine a national champion off a poll, well, it's not fair, it's not right. Okay, now we have a national title game. Well, how do we decide that? Okay, well, that's not right. All right, but BCS, that's not right. And it's just I think there's this delusion in the idea of some college football fans that there's this perfect goal you can get to. And in reality, there isn't. Like you're dealing with an imperfect way. You're trying to crown a champion across 128, 134. I can't remember how many Division One schools there are right now. Like it's not going to be pretty. So, like whatever, there's going to be a downside to everything that you do. And it's just a little asinine that people continue to gripe about this when I'll be honest with you. It has not always been pretty. They've not always gotten it right. And the selection committee has not always been of pure heart or pure mind. They have had biases. But, like, I don't know how you watch last night and don't think to yourself, oh, thank God. Because I'll tell you right now, with Trent Rodemaker or Timmy Rademacher or Trent Rosenkrantz or whatever, Rosenkrantz and Guildenstern, whoever the hell would have been the Florida State starting quarterback, any one of those matchups, and Florida State is beat and housed by 3, 4, maybe 5 scores. And I don't know how you watch the Florida State Georgia game, and more importantly, watch last night and understand that so much of the magic of Florida State was Jordan Travis. And what I would say to Seminoles fans, because I think I do understand the hurt and the frustration. You had a special season that was cut short because of injury, and nobody likes to do that. And we'd like to throw around words like fair. Oh, it's not fair. It's college football. It is a business. All right. Life isn't fair. There's a lot of things that happen in the world of any sort of business, whether you're in radio, whether you're in TV, whether you're in marketing, whether you're a finance bro, that aren't fair. And this idea that the world has to be fair and there's these white knights that can save it is kind of embarrassing. And the idea that the only place that we hold to a standard of fairness is college athletics because of some misguided, outdated representation of amateurism. Here's the best thing I can say to Knowles fans. Because again, none of what I just said matters to you. It's your team. It was a special year. And it's okay to feel like you got screwed. But here's what I can tell Knowles fans. If the same thing happened to Washington, if Michael Penix Jr. with 3 games to go blew out his knee, Washington would not have been in the playoffs yesterday. They just wouldn't have. They would not have. They would not have been facing Texas right now.
It probably would have been Michigan. It probably would have been Bama. It would have been Georgia. It would have been Texas. Those would have been the 4 teams that were in.
So the reason why I point that out is like that is another team where the quarterback is so special. The way Jordan Travis is special to the Knowles and their chances to compete. He's so special. You take him off that team. They're a good team. They're not a great team. So it just happened to be Florida State that caught it this year. But like to do this whole, and I'm not saying Florida State fans are doing this, although some Florida politicians.
Well, I think they are.
But
they've lost their minds. They're like going after Kirk Herbstreit, saying it's his fault. They're blaming ESPN. Like the conspiracy theory rabbit holes are rampant. Which, by the way, the ACC has a deal with ESPN. Like it doesn't behoove them to not have an ACC team in. But it's also funny because the irony of the ACC being the one conference that voted against going to 12 teams this year And then they're the conference that got left out is kind of funny when you look back on it. Like, how can you not look back on that and laugh? Like you basically wrote your own, you dug your own grave. You said you did this to yourself. You could have had 12 teams this year. And you talk about fairness, Nick. Like, I think, yes, nothing to this point's been fair, and nothing's going to be totally fair at all times in sports. And that's just kind of how it goes. I mean, shit, the Lions just lost a game to the Cowboys on Saturday night because the officials blew the understanding who was going to be eligible, who wasn't going to be eligible on the offensive line. Like, that's what happens in sports sometimes, and it isn't always fair. But I do think, like, if you want fairness, you're getting the best system for that next year, and that they're going to say, hey, we're putting 12 teams in, and even some teams that maybe don't fully deserve it are going to at least have a shot, and then you get a chance to see if you can do anything with it. And so that is going to be the fairest system. And you guys flat out said no to that. This year, you said, no, we're good. Let's stick with 4. Okay, well, now you got left out, and now you're going to learn that maybe you should have done it this way in the first place. But, yes, to your point, if the injury had happened to Michael Penix Jr., I think the same thing applies. I think the same thing applies if that happened to any of these 4 teams. Like, if you lose a starting key player, particularly at that position, I think the committee would have had a conversation about it and thought about what was going to make sense, or if it were they were putting the right teams in. So it's just kind of par for the course. And I think on some level, could you make an argument that maybe Georgia should have got in over Bama or something like that? Maybe. But I think ultimately, like, when you get good games, it at least on some level validates that the committee got something right in putting matchups out there. Because my biggest argument always is, Nick, I understand there's a lot of blowouts in college football. I get that happens. But when you get 2 evenly matched teams against each other, I think college football ends up being more entertaining a lot of times than even the NFL. And I think we saw that on full display last night, 2 different styles of teams versus each other. And those games were super, super entertaining from start to finish.
All right, guys, we got more to get into. I will take another stab at addressing what happened with the Cotton Bowl with Ohio State, with Ryan Day, state of the program type stuff. And could social media be showing us that there is a white knight riding majestically off in the distance that could be headed to save Ohio State, nay, Columbus? But first, a word from our sponsors.